Thanks, Kayla. So we are at session 3. What can the PUC do to ensure resource adequacy for electric distribution customers? And we have a number of esteemed panelists, 9 to be exact. So we will start with Susan Bruce from the Industrial Customer Coalition. Just introduce yourself, say who you represent, and try not to go too into detail with the discussion. This is just introductions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so very much for the invitation to be with you today. It's been a great discussion and lots of great ideas, and look forward to this afternoon. As you mentioned, my name is Susan Bruce. I'm co-chair of the Energy Group at McNeese and counsel to the PJM Industrial Customer Coalition and the Pennsylvania Energy Consumer Alliance, which are coalitions of energy-intensive customers in the PJM footprint and Pennsylvania, respectively. Our members include heavy industry, such as steel, consumer good producers, battery manufacturers, air separation companies, as well as institutional customers like hospitals and universities. While the membership of the coalitions are diverse, there is a common thread, and the paramount need for electricity is that. Paramount need for electricity for these businesses to realize their business objectives and for electricity to be priced such that they can stay in business. Thank you for the opportunity to share our ideas today. We do find ourselves in a critical juncture. On the one hand, we have the exciting promise of the proliferation of environmentally preferred resources, driven not so much by PJM price signals, but by state and federal policies such as RPSs and tax credits, as well as customer demand. These resources have flooded the PJM interconnection queues. At the same time, for various reasons, including state and federal policies also, thermal generation is retiring at an alarming rate, while load growth is projected to occur at an unprecedented level due to the addition of large single-point loads that dwarf even the largest industrial load. This confluence creates a real prospect of a capacity resource gap, which is alarming as electricity is an essential component of our economy, so we appreciate your leadership. With Pennsylvania's restructured electricity market, the tools that the PUC has available now are different than they were, say, 30 years ago, and different than what exists in certain other states in the PJM footprint, like Virginia and West Virginia. Using its current tools, we perceive some opportunities for the PUC to help close this reliability gap, but new tools may be necessary also. Also, we shouldn't ignore that Pennsylvania sits upon a tremendous resource in terms of abundant natural gas. However, what shouldn't change is harnessing the power of competitive forces, which was so important to drive the innovation that enabled Pennsylvania to transition from coal to natural gas about 15 years ago. PJM, ICC, and PICA also see need for changes in PJM rules to account for the reality that price signals may simply be unable to overcome certain realities and still produce just and reasonable rates and resource adequacy. Thank you for the opportunity here today and look forward to the discussion.
Patrick.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, Chairman, Commissioner Zerfas. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these critical issues on behalf of Pennsylvania consumers. My name is Patrick Cicero. I have the pleasure of serving as Pennsylvania's consumer advocate. I had really enjoyed the first 2 panels this morning, and will try to limit my remarks today to the question at hand for this panel, which is what the Public Utility Commission can do under existing framework to incentivize, maintain, and ensure resource adequacy. I would just submit that I think that no one should question that is the job of the Public Utility Commission. I think the statute requires the Commission to ensure reliable and least cost, but reliable distribution, transmission, and in part of that is this generation issue that we're dealing with. So I think at first blush, I think it's abundantly clear if one looks at the Public Utility Code that this is a core responsibility of the Public Utility Commission, irrespective of the fact that we are a restructured state. The fact that we're a restructured state means that generation is no longer rate regulated, but it does not mean that the Public Utility Commission does not have the authority and tools necessary to ensure continued reliability. I assure you that if something happens, you will be blamed, And so consequently, if you will be blamed, then you should have the tools necessary to fix this problem. There's some ideas that I have that I'd be happy to talk about in the context of this panel. I don't want to talk about them as in my introductory remarks. I just want to reemphasize, or I want to emphasize that while I think that PJM has a resource adequacy problem, Pennsylvania does not. We are resource adequacy rich. We have a lot of generating resources in the Commonwealth. And the question that I think that we collectively, not only the Public Utility Commission, but those of us who operate in this space need to confront is, how do we ensure that Pennsylvania gets access to its generating resources, right? So I would submit that part of the problem that we have with resource adequacy now is a function of us being aligned and coordinated within PJM. And that made abundant sense for a long time and still remains pretty commonsensical for a variety of reasons. But there are levers and tools that we need to use and utilize as the Keystone State to ensure that Pennsylvanians get Pennsylvania energy first. And so I have some ideas about that I would love to talk about as the panel proceeds, but I'll leave you waiting for now. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Good afternoon. My name is David Fusfus. I'm the Vice President of Energy Policy for Duquesne Light Company in Pittsburgh. I'm also the company's General Counsel. Duquesne has about 600,000 customers in western Pennsylvania, primarily in the city of Pittsburgh, in Allegheny and Beaver counties. Go Steelers. And I have just a couple introductory comments. Similar to, I think, most of the panelists, I have some specific recommendations to make. But from the overview, I just want to make a couple comments. I agree the two panel discussions that we had this morning, I think, were very helpful. I also think that this is a situation where we all need to be part of the solution. We need to sort of put aside, to a certain degree, our partisan or commercial perspectives, because the top priority is making sure that the lights stay on in Pennsylvania. And if there's a risk that the lights are going to go out, the electric distribution companies like Duquesne Light, our customers are going to call us first, and they're probably going to call the commission second. So we're sort of on the cutting edge with respect to this, but it impacts all of us. And so I think of this as very much a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue from both whether you're on the generator side of this, or you're on the retail side of it, or you're on the utility side of it, or the customer side of it. We all need to be part of the solution. And I also think this is not a Democratic or Republican Party issue. It's also a bipartisan issue, because the solutions that we're going to need to identify for Pennsylvania are going to require that bipartisanship. And I think as you look at any solution, and we saw this morning as we talked through these, we have to look at both reliability and affordability. And those are the two key tenets that no matter what the circumstances are, what's being proposed, we have to consider and weigh both. I also agree from the second panel today, and the first panel was clear that perhaps Pennsylvania does not have an issue with respect to reliability, but PJM is certainly saying, look, we're all part of one power pool, and there's a risk that the lights are going to go out in Pennsylvania at some point in time because we're part of that pool. So how do we best mitigate that risk? And I think that's part of the conversation we have today. And as I said, I've got a couple of proposed solutions, but I'll save those for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Tori?
Good afternoon. My name is Tori Giesler. I am here on behalf of First Energy. I am managing counsel in our state regulatory group within legal. On behalf of First Energy, I want to first say that I appreciate the opportunity to participate in our discussion today. This is a critically important topic that we're grateful the Commission is taking the initiative to have this conversation about. The company is deeply concerned about the looming resource adequacy challenges that we heard a lot about up to the point of this panel today. And we're concerned about specifically what the impacts to our customers will be. With the advent of our consolidation of our 4 distribution operating companies here in Pennsylvania earlier this year, we now have, we serve a collective 2 million customers in Pennsylvania. I share many of the concerns that we've heard from Patrick and others here about the fact that Pennsylvania is a net exporter, but ultimately is facing this challenge alongside everyone else on behalf of those customers. Our specific fear is that while there is a capacity market construct in existence, The world today is very different than when it was designed and for the purpose for which it was designed. And while we recognize that that is the case and there are efforts underway to initiate change to that, our concern is that the markets are not going to be able to solve the gap in capacity needs across the region in time to ensure that sufficient grid resources are available. And that being the case, it's leading us to believe that state-initiated action is necessary. We've spent a lot of time internally at First Energy looking across our footprint and thinking about what that might look like, and specifically identifying the criteria of out-of-market solutions that might be viable in helping to assist in solving for this challenge. In addition to those criteria, there are very specific characteristics that we've identified that we believe are going to be very critical as part of any successful solution. So we're very excited to be able to talk about those today as part of this panel. But with that, thank you for inviting us.
So I have to say, this side of the panel, this side appears to be solution rich, so we can't wait to hear what you guys have to say.
Try to tee this up well, guys. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Brian Kaufman with Mainspring Energy, and thank you so much for all the work that led to this, and this is a great way to tee up this conversation. Just three main comments in my opening remarks. First, as a manufacturer of dispatchable power generation equipment, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the governor, his staff, and bipartisan members of the General Assembly for the nearly $9 million investment into our company to bring us to Pennsylvania. Right now we're manufacturing primarily in California and Mexico, but we're building our first large-scale factory outside of Pittsburgh, go Steelers, and bringing 600 good-paying jobs where we'll manufacture, when we fully operate, 1,000 generators a year. So it's a huge, my second point kind of brings me to, this is a huge economic opportunity, not just for our company, but for the region. We see, particularly in the data center space, because that gathers so much headline, but folks want to go where there's power and low-cost power. You see a lot of natural gas-rich regions seeing that, and my anticipation is Pennsilvania could be next. And so our company wants to be supportive of that. And we see in Texas, this $10 billion that they've deployed already. Our company is not supportive of any specific solution. We just want to see more power come on faster, regardless of ownership and market structure. And then that brings me to my final point, which is we're not the only solution provider in this space, but when we hear from PJM, the IMM, the type of solutions we need are those kind of operational, flexible resources, and not just operationally flexible, but fuel type. A lot of us lived here during Winter Storm Elliott. It was a 5-day event. Things like battery storage are great for intraday flexibility, but they're not going to get you through 5 days, as we saw in that case. So we need technologies that can do that. Dual fuel. Our technology can run on natural gas, hydrogen, ammonia, biogas, 100% without any capital changes. So we think it's part of the solution. And then finally, we need something with more environmental attributes and flexibility there as well. Our technology running on natural gas is more efficient than the existing CTs out there, but it can also be a net zero product if you want to run it on biogas, green ammonia, green hydrogen fuels that we think, especially with 7 hydrogen hubs getting built around the country, we're going to see. So that concludes my opening remarks. I'm happy to talk more about solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Christine Martin. I'm the president of PPL Electric Utilities. We serve 1.5 million. Is your mic on? There we go. Thank you, Matt. Christine Martin, president of PPL Electric Utilities. We serve 1.5 million customers in 29 counties in Pennsylvania and have been proud to be headquartered in Pennsylvania for more than 100 years. So we too have some thoughts around solutions. Let me first and foremost say that we want to be an active participant and a constructive participant. The folks on this panel, many of the folks on this panel have been involved with energy policy in the state for some time, and I think have found ways to work together to partner for the benefit of Pennsylvania. And I would suggest that as we find our way forward with resource adequacy and what we view as an impending resource adequacy crisis, that we draw on those experiences and that collaborative experience to keep Pennsylvania as a leader in the energy space. I think our customers and our communities should demand it, and it is foundational for economic growth and resiliency in the state. So let me just start with 3 points, and happy to, of course, to delve in as we move forward with the panel. So first, the state must take an active role. As has already been said by the advocate, consumer advocate, under the code, the Public Utility Commission has the obligation for resource adequacy. I would submit that you have the obligation and the responsibility without sufficient legislative authority to fully carry that out. Similarly, electric distribution companies have an obligation to serve reliably and at reasonable costs. There are not a lot of tools beyond our transmission and distribution assets that we have to do that. And something like the situation that we are seeing in PJM and that we see on the horizon for Pennsylvania, even a state that is currently energy rich, is extremely concerning to me as a president of a utility with 1.5 million customers. We don't see ourselves as a passive entity in resource adequacy. We think that there are solutions that EDCs can also bring to bear, up to and including investment in generation and generation technology. And I think foundationally, a lot of this conversation is around how do we promote investments in much needed generation and generation technologies and ancillary services. And then third, I would just talk, we hear a lot about risk. Our customers bear risk. Even in a deregulated market, customers bear risk of generation inadequacy. Our customers bear risks of generation premiums. At the end of the day, someone pays the bill, and that is our end-use customers. So I would just suggest that as we think about resource adequacy, as we think about solutions, as we think about risks, we have not completely shifted risk away from customers. So with that, I'm happy to participate, and I thank the PUC for this important discussion.
Good afternoon. Glenn Thomas, President of GT Power Group. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Just a quick caveat, any remarks I give today are going to be mine and mine alone and not any GT Power clients. I come here before you as a fellow Pennsylvanian who's been involved with energy policy for a long, long time. I think Christine might have been talking about me when she mentioned, the folks around the table have been doing this a while, but it's great to be back in this room. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and I appreciate some of the technology upgrades that have happened here in this building. A couple initial thoughts. One, I think, sometimes it's helpful just for Pennsylvania to reflect on where it is. And one of the privileges of my job is I get to go around to other states and even around the world and look at how, other people are doing things when it comes to electricity policy and electricity market models. And I will say Pennsylvania is in a really good spot right now compared to a lot of folks. May not feel that way by the tenor of the conversation today, but when I look at it from a reliability, a cost, and environmental situation, the three legs of the stool, Pennsylvania has a lot to be proud of. Our reliability, we have an 18 gigawatt surplus, you heard that. We have invested in this state like no other state has done in this country over the last 20 years. All of that has been with merchant capital, at-risk capital, not on the backs of ratepayers. Our prices, like I said, you've heard me say, maybe you've heard me say this multiple times before, that we're once above the national average or now below the national average. NOx, SOx, carbon emissions, I'll put them up against any state in this country. We've done a lot here in Pennsylvania, and it's because we've had a model that's worked. And the reason that model has worked here in Pennsylvania is because of the people around this room being committed and working together to a similar market model that is based on competition. I mean, that has been the bulwark of our policy, our bulwark of our market model for since 1996. And we should all be very, very proud of that. So why is Pennsylvania in such a good spot? Like I said, it's about the market model. It's about people willing to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. I agree with David 100%. Solutions to any problem facing Pennsylvania should be done collaboratively. One of the things I think that's amazing about Pennsylvania is you look at the bipartisan back and forth with the governor's level, but through all that, this policy has survived and actually thrived, and we've seen a lot of success as a result of that. So maybe I'll stop there. Chairman DeFrank, I have 7 do's and 3 don'ts. I will get to those at some point, but appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair, Chair, and Commissioner. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I'm Dave Velasquez, President and CEO of PECO Energy, or PECO, headquartered in Philadelphia. I think this is really a very timely discussion, and glad that we're having it. As folks have mentioned, PA in some ways maybe is in an enviable spot at the moment, having a surplus of generation, but also as noted, we are part of a pool that is not in the same enviable position as we are. And also has been noted, the delivery times for some of the solutions to that, whether it was turbines, we heard 28, 29, and other major equipment has multiple year lead times. So I don't think we have 3 years to figure this out, even though Pennsylvania is at the moment capacity rich. We are part of a pool, and we need to take action and move forward. As I thought about what we're trying to solve for, we've talked about the fact that we need reliable supply for our customers. We need to be able to do it at an affordable level. But I'd also add to that list, we need to continue to spur economic development, or have the resources to spur economic development in the Commonwealth. We also have to make sure we're addressing any of the jurisdictional climate goals, and we also have to make sure we're doing it in a way that is equitable for all our customers. Our preference at Exelon, as a part of the Exelon set of utility companies, we also serve utilities in New Jersey. We also serve customers in New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and also the District of Columbia. So as we think about a broad view of where PJM is, our preference has always been to rely on the capacity market at PJM. However, I think as everybody has noted, with the recent auctions, there are reforms that we see are necessary to make sure that the generation and transmission needed to provide reliable and affordable energy to our customers is delivered with a sense of urgency and happens sooner rather than later. Ideally, I think this could be solved at the PJM level, but based on the experience we have seen, I think we need to be talking and thinking about other solutions, and glad as we go through the conversation to talk about some of that. But again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Janine Zappa. I'm the Executive Director of the Keystone Energy Efficiency Alliance, and we're a trade association of energy efficiency businesses that serve the Commonwealth. And I'm also in that same role as the Executive Director of our sister organization, which is a 501c3 educational organization. But I am here today for KIA. Thank you so much, Vice Chair Barrow, Chair DeFrank, and Commissioner Zerfas. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank the staff as well for convening this technical conference. We think this is the kind of thing that is critical and a starting point, and we hope that you will do more of this. It's clear there's all kinds of players. I almost feel like I'm at a conference of people who run gyms, and everybody else is saying, buy equipment. And I'm like, do more reps, do more energy efficiency reps, right? We all have our role to play, but we need everybody for it to work. And the PUC in particular has a very critical, even pivotal role to play to ensure resource adequacy. And you do need to balance the need for affordability, reliability, and security, along with the impact of our electricity structure on markets and developers, on equity issues, which is something we have not talked about at all today, and on the environment. And so I do, too, also have a list, but I will not get into my litany, but I'll hit a couple of really quick highlights of things that I think, if you think about the way an electric bill is structured, we have a lot of solutions we've discussed so far about transmission and distribution, and we are very pro non-wires, non-pipes solutions as part of the mix. And I think as something that is directly within the control of the PUC to be thinking about, to think about rate structures with the new FERC 1920A order just issued last week. There is a call for the state to have a more abundant role in working with PJM about how the costs across PJM are structured and shared back with states. And, we'd like to see more of the virtual power plants. But lastly, maybe I'll conclude on something that's near and dear to our heart in the energy efficiency world. And I do really want to talk about Act 129 later, so I'll just say that. I've got my list, you've got your list, Greg. We'll get through our lists. Patrick has a list. Building science matters, right? So it really, at some level, all of this change is needed to ensure resource. We need to talk about the part that customers can control with their usage. And, building science doesn't go away, right? It does not matter which equipment we put in and even how efficient it is if the building itself is still leaky. And so we have an abundance of programs, but we really haven't actually solved that issue. So we'd like you to do more reps on energy efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we go through the questions, just raise your tent card if you want to contribute. So the first question is, well, no, I'm going to back up to December 2022, Winter Storm Elliott once again. One of my favorite topics because it was astounding to me that we were in the position that we were in at that point when Pennsylvania itself, the Commonwealth, is sitting on top of the Marcellus Shale, and we export into the region. We have a 18 gigawatt surplus on energy. What can the PUC help this state to do so that we do not find ourselves in that position again? And this is it's a really broad question, but it's about, are there tools that we have in our toolbox, whether it is energy efficiency, whether it is how the commission designs rates, what can we do? Patrick.
Well, I think there's a number of things that you can do, and I'd actually like to start with something more basic than rate design, and that has to do with education, right? Like part of the problem in 2022 was very few people actually knew what they were supposed to do in response to some call by PJM for this kind of like grid emergency, right? So I think PJM has an obvious role to play in terms of like getting better at education, but so does, in terms of like the state Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission emergency response, EDC level education about steps that consumers can actually take. And not just, residential consumers, but, businesses. So there's this question about, and this gets into the question of load, right? What role does load play in this resource adequacy conversation? Some of that's energy efficiency, as Janine mentioned, but demand response is huge. So the ability of our electric distribution utilities to be incentivized to have demand response programs that actually enable them to respond to grid emergencies, whether that's at a residential level or a commercial level or an industrial level, right? There's a lot of work that can be done on the demand response side that will help with the resource adequacy problem that doesn't involve all the things that the panels talked about. I mean, there's this whole grid gas coordination problem. There's all the things that was discussed prior to this. But in terms of the commission with education, requiring education about the idea that we have a resource adequacy concern, right? Whether the EDCs are doing that or the commission's doing that. Demand response and energy efficiency programming matters a lot in terms of responding to that so that come the holiday season, we don't have this, and if we do, people know what to do, right? Or the EDCs can actualize this through a direct load control program or some other type of program that's been incentivized through Act 129 or otherwise.
Okay, so almost everyone has their cards up, so we're just going to go in order, starting with Susan.
Thanks. I would agree with many of the things that Patrick said, especially around thinking about education and communication and having those lines of communication open. It was a perfect storm, to be quite sure. I mean, no one wants to get the call on Christmas Eve that you should be turning out your Christmas lights. I mean, that's not a good day. And I drove around, I didn't see a lot of lights out. and that, we got through it. But I put my tent up more to think about the demand response component, because, certainly industrials have been, I would call it base load demand response for decades. And it's a very useful tool when we think about resource adequacy, having that be part of the puzzle. And especially now when it's very difficult to think about supply resources getting online, DR is something that exists now. One of the challenges, and I will, before I go into, DR has had some challenges, some haircuts in terms of the change to the effective load carrying capability, and in large measure due to administrative decisions about how the programs are set up. PJM is working on some of those things, and I don't want, and I think that they're moving in the right direction, so I don't want to downplay their good work in that space. But I would also say that probably if we, when there are real resource adequacy issues, I think an all of the above approach works. I don't want to say anything that would necessarily undercut the opportunities that exist in the markets, but not all demand response exists in the PJM markets anymore. Some of it's occurring behind the meter. And in other regions of the country, the utilities have good communications with their largest industrials when there are reliability issues. There's calls that are made, and most industrials see their role in the corporate community. So I think that there is a space there to supplement when we're thinking, I think being very open-minded about some of those things. I would be remiss if I didn't, I think that one of the things when we think about anything where there's a payment stream, creating programs where there's, how do you pay for the demand response? I think that the more things that end up on a customer's bill during this time when we're seeing skyrocketing transmission costs, resource adequacy's challenges, sort of minimizing the sort of extra charges that are on a customer's bill is something that I think most businesses, hearkening to the economic development concerns, that we should be very mindful of as well. So I just want to be, thoughtful about the opportunity for demand response, but also sort of being thoughtful about how do we get there in a way that doesn't end up adding more costs onto customers' bills.
David.
The question you asked about, what happened and how do we prevent them from happening again, we should, within Pennsylvania, already know the answer to that. And the fact that we don't, I think, is part of the problem. So number one on our list of what does the commission have authority to do and what should they do is an integrated resource assessment. We've talked about reliability, and clearly the commission continues to have responsibility with respect to reliability. So when I talk about integrated resource assessment, there's sort of two sides to that. One is looking at, do we need more generation? What type of generation do we need, and when do we need it? So that's part of it, and I think there needs to be a 10-year look at that. Number two is finding out and engaging with PJM on these scenarios of when the power may go out in Pennsylvania. So that's part of that integrated resource assessment. We should know within Pennsylvania what the risks are of the power going out and the lights going out, like we almost had with Elliott. So how do you go about doing that? Again, we think you have the authority to say to the generators in Pennsylvania, to the EDCs in Pennsylvania, and to PJM, listen, you need to provide us with all of that data so that we can then do our own assessment within the state over a 10-year look of, do we have enough generation? If we've got shortfalls in particular parts of the state, like when is that shortfall going to arise? What type of generation do we need to fill that? And also have from PJM that assessment of when there's a risk of the power going out. And, if you go back, and a lot of us have been here since this started, in the early 2000s, the states made the decision to turn authority for this type of planning over to PJM. And that's worked great for the last 20 plus years, but now there's concerns about it. And so there's a gap. There's not that sort of state level assessment. And so we need to take back ownership of that, again, in collaboration with PJM and with the other players to get that information. But you all have the authority to do that from our perspective. So that, in terms of like dealing with an Elliott, we should never be in a position again where you don't know and there isn't that information available. And I would add to that, the commission is in a unique position to then be the single source of the facts of what's going on in the state. So that as we're making decisions going forward about, do we need legislation? What should the commission be doing? What should the EDCs be doing? What should be going on in the PJM marketplace? We have one set of facts that everybody agrees on. If I think there was something that was missing from the first panel discussion this morning was you got a lot of generalities. You didn't get a lot of facts and specifics. And again, within the state, we need to own that ourselves.
Thank you, David. Brian.
Thank you. I generally agree with what we just heard from Susan and David. I'll say in my role, I get to talk to regions across the country, and I think we were very lucky in this last situation with Elliott. With the number of outages, there were 90 gigawatts of coincident outages across the Eastern Interconnect, and miraculously 9 million people lost power, and only about 100 people died only. It could have been even worse than that, but that is quite an impressive and disastrous event. In terms of what we could do, just to add on to what you've heard, I think PJM has done a lot. I was part of the PJM stakeholder body that helped implement the ELCC changes that expanded to all resource types, and we're really the first region in the country that's done that. And we heard from one of the prior speakers that effectively that took it reduced the number of expected power stations that were available by 20, the equivalent of 20 power stations, because the average gas accreditation was at 97% before that. Now it's closer to 77%. So I think that was critical action that really PJM was in the best position to do. But when it comes to what the commission can do, there's certainly a wide range of things. What's right in front of you, I think, is the rate-making power we heard about earlier this morning. When we talked about, I'm worried because PJM now says they're going to have 50 gigawatts of data centers by 2030. Most of these are 24/7 loads. During the holidays, thankfully, a lot of people were home and demand wasn't relatively high. It could have been a lot worse. So there needs to be rate-making authority that allows you to incentivize customers to shut down, so it's not just relying on their good corporate citizenship. And even if it was just the top 1,000 hours or 300 hours of the year and said, well, in exchange for not being on for those hours, you pay you're in a different rate tier, for instance, and maybe it's even a carrot then to incent business development in the state, especially as you see more AI developers say that, hey, we're creating tools to create flexibility in our loads. So I would support that retail conversation.
Thanks. Christine?
Thank you. So I'm not going to repeat what was already said, that my top two issues have been taken and explained well. But let me talk about a third, and that's really getting the most out of the resources that we currently have from a transmission and a distribution level. So interesting, in talking about Winter Storm Elliott, one of the points in PJM's report was around the use of dynamic line rating that PPL used or had employed on a transmission line. It was our Juniata line, actually, that prevented more extreme outages in Winter Storm Elliott. And that is a fairly low-cost technology to expand the capacity and unlock capacity of the transmission system. I think we need to look at those things as well on the distribution system and what those applications are. I do think, having policies and rate structures that support that kind of alternative investment in the system makes a lot of sense. We also have increasing DER, right? It's been exponential, and in particular, a lot of solar resources that are coming in that the customers are paying for. We need to be able to use those resources effectively as a distribution asset. Things like virtual power plants, having good visibility into the distribution system around planning, around management to one, unlock coasting capacity, and two, really understand what we have and how we put those resources to work from a distribution level that is an increasing resource for us. I think we all see that. And so I think we need to look at certainly the generation side. Someone earlier talked about winterization and work under CPCNs. I would remind the Commission, of course, we do not have a CPCN process in Pennsylvania, so there are maybe some limitations there. Certainly understanding what we have, a longer outlook. I would say that the Commission certainly has the authority, and I would suggest an independent look, not just reliance on public information from NERC and PJM in that energy outlook. But again, unlocking capacity in our transmission and distribution systems, I think, is perhaps untapped potential.
Okay. Thanks. Glenn?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. And one, I think it's important to remember what Winter Storm Elliott was, and that wasn't a failure of not having enough megawatts on the system. In fact, I mean, we can go back and look at the numbers. My gut tells me we probably had a 25 to 28% reserve margin in 2022. In fact, the reserve margin, and that's about 10% above what is required. And a lot of folks, including OPSI at the time, were writing letters and making filings at FERC saying we have too much capacity on the system. Consumers are paying too much. We should actually be reducing the amount of capacity on the system. So it wasn't a failure of having enough megawatts or resources on the ground. It was a failure of those megawatts to do what they needed to do at that moment. And there were a lot of reasons for that. There's been reports written about that. I mean, I could point you to a lot of things, whether it's PJM missing the load forecast, some gas electric coordination issues. I think there's a lot of things you can do when you pull back the layers of what happened in Winter Storm Elliott. You realize it's not a resource adequacy problem. It was a resource performance problem driven by a lot of different factors. And I also think, just to respond to a few other comments that were made, markets are cyclical. I mean, this is not the first time in 25, 30 years that there have been concerns about reliability in PJM. In fact, I would point to you, one of the fun things about preparing for this panel was to go back and take some walks down memory lane. Here was a bill in New Jersey in 2010. And I'm just going to read you a paragraph from that bill. This bill eventually was passed and signed into law by Governor Christie. And it says, to alleviate the cost burdens and barriers to new entry created by the PJM reliability pricing model, the construction of new efficient in-state generation must be fostered by state policy to avoid higher electricity prices, higher congestion, and reliability concerns. Okay? Like I said, it was introduced 2010, New Jersey General Assembly. This is Senate Bill 2381, if anybody wants to look it up. It was signed into law and then eventually led to, and I got some handouts here. Betsy has a copy of this, so this is in the record. I'll pass it out. But it led to the LCAP program in New Jersey. If you guys could share. So why do I bring this up as an example? I mean, what New Jersey did was they thought they had a reliability concern in 2010. They were convinced, and you can read quotes from Governor Christie along these lines, that there would never be a new natural gas plant built in New Jersey, or in the rest of PJM for that matter. So they took it onto themselves to basically produce a subsidy program for these new natural gas plants. They said, all right, natural gas plants, come to us and tell us what your capacity price is you need. Get what you can out of the market, and we'll make up the difference. It was called a contract for differences approach. New Jersey approved 3 of these contracts for 3 different facilities. The information in front of you was the one that became public information out of this. So if I direct you to the left column there, those are the contracted capacity prices that were awarded by the New Jersey BPU for a new natural gas plant. This is back in 2012, mind you, that they approved those capacity prices. And as you can see, those prices range from $286 to $432. So when the folks in New Jersey are mad about the $270 clear, you may want to remind them that for 15 straight years, they were going to have capacity payments to those customers, or from those customers to these facilities, well above that $270 clearing price. You can see in that second column, that's what the actual clearing prices were. And in the third column, you can see the difference. So that was the amount that they were willing to subsidize these these gas-fired power plants over the course of this program. Like I said, if you add up the column on the right there, you get a little over $400 million. With 3 plants, you're looking at over $1 billion that New Jersey ratepayers would have been paying for these power plants. By the way, these power plants all got built. They're all operating today. Some of them are actually P3 members who many of you know I represent. So these plants are on the system today, and New Jersey ratepayers would have been paying up to $1 billion in subsidies for these plants, but for the fact this whole thing was unconstitutional. And parties took this to the Supreme Court, litigated all the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said New Jersey did not have the constitutional authority to do it. I raised this in the context, like I said, this was 2010 when New Jersey was worried about reliability. They made a very critical mistake that would have cost their consumers a lot of money, but for the fact it was litigated and determined to be unconstitutional. So it's great to think about these plans, it's great to think about the future, but it's very hard to predict the future with these markets. These markets are cyclical. Let me give you one other example, and this is from our home state here in Pennsylvania. So this is from, and I'm gonna, I lost my paper. I wanted to make reference to the folks, just give me a minute, because it's such a good quote. It was from Representative, or excuse me, Senator Almond, Senator Boscola. Here we go. I apologize. Here it is. Okay. So this is 2019. Okay. Legislative memo, February 4th, 2019. Unless we address this inequity, and the equity is the fact that nuclear plants were not included in Pennsylvania's AEPS program. To address this inequity, unless we address this inequity, 3 Mile Island will shut down in October of 2019, Beaver Valley will shut down in 2021, and the Commonwealth's 3 other nuclear power plants are likely not far behind. To be clear, the shutdown process is irreversible, thereby guaranteeing the permanent loss of Pennsylvania's nuclear assets. 4 years ago, and we know what's happening now. Not only are all the Pennsylvania nuclear plants still there, one is coming back that was retired. These markets are cyclical. They have ebbs and flows. And are we at one of those moments right now where we need to reflect and think where we are? 100%. Are there things we need to be doing? 100%. Are there conversations we should be talking about? Yes. But I guess one of my overarching principles here, number one on my to-do list, is maintain perspective, maintain a little bit of patience, and understand that these markets are cyclical, and these are not the first time that reliability concerns have been raised over the last 20, 25 years here. Thank you.
So, not the last time, but what worries me is it seems as though every time there is a juncture in the market where we start worrying about reliability, while we are going through it, we get so close to the edge, and we don't know. We do not know when we're going to be just, I don't know, 100 megawatts shy of meeting demand.
Yeah.
That's what worries me. The volatility is what worries me. And that's a lot to ask my ratepayers who they're paying good money for the service.
100%.
And I don't think they should be asked to deal with that degree of volatility.
A couple thoughts. Are you okay? I don't want to free up the agenda here, but a couple thoughts. I mean, one, there was a time when PJM actually did run out of megawatts on the system. It was in 1994. And there were rolling brownouts. Many of us remember those. And it was while the utilities had plans, and it was before restructuring. But that was the one time in PJM's history where we actually did run out of megawatts. So again, to the point, this is nothing new. I mean, you never want to be in those circumstances. 94 was a really rough weather year, but that's when we hit the brownouts. In terms of the volatility, I agree 100%. I think one of the challenges that needs to be addressed is PJM's capacity market volatility. One of the things on my to-do list is take a good look at that PJM 205 filing that's going to be coming in the next month. That is aimed at trying to reduce the capacity market price volatility, because I agree. Having prices that go from 28 to 270 is not helpful to investment. That needs to be fixed. Customers should not be exposed to volatile prices, and that goes to Travis's point that you heard on the earlier panel. That's where the retail market can be incredibly helpful in managing that volatility. So, I mean, I agree. I mean, we don't want to see consumers exposed to that volatility. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, we have the tools for them to address it.
David?
Thank you. Just a couple different comments. First, Glenn, appreciate the examples. you know, a lot of those periods, though, PJM as a whole was running a reserve margin above 20%. We're not looking now, as we look to the future, of a condition where PJM is going to be running that rich of a reserve margin. One thing I did want to comment on is, you know, I mentioned earlier, there's a certain sense of urgency we have to have, and therefore, as we look at solutions, first, we need to look at a wide variety of solutions, but we also need to think about speed to market, right? Which is where I think, you know, demand response, energy efficiency, there's a host of things that we should be doing and encouraging in the short term that are well within the Commission's discretion to begin moving forward as well. I also think that there's a need, again, utilities, I think, and the Commission have a unique responsibility to our customers to make sure the lights stay on. And, you know, as David had suggested, you know, the Commission has the authority to take a look at where we stand and where we're going to stand. And as we heard about the time frames that it takes to implement solutions, it needs to be more than a couple year. It probably does need to be a 5 or a 10-year lookout to make sure that we are all agreeing collectively that I'll say PJM has it right, that we agree with where load is going to be. We agree where the resources are going to be, whether they're energy efficiency, demand response, whether what's coming through the PJM markets, to make sure that we don't end up in a situation. You know, this is one of those situations where we can see something, but it's almost far enough out in the future that it's easy to say we can wait. But I think, again, some of what we heard today is, you know, what happens 4 years from now is happening today. We got to make that decision today to worry about what's happening 4 years. So again, that's why I think there's a sense, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because we do need to start thinking about where we're going to be 4 years from now.
I would just add we're probably even a little late to the table on that, Dave, but certainly I don't think there's anyone that doesn't sense the need of urgency here. You know, we're talking 4 years out.
Janine, and then Tori.
Yeah, thank you. I think David and Christine said something really important about data and independent. And there was a great Wall Street Journal article on November 11 with a whole bunch of recommendations about how to stabilize the grid and different issues, and a number of the things that have been discussed today were in there. But one that was not so far is the idea of really doing much more sophisticated modeling and using AI to take a look at multiple scenarios and no longer relying on historical data alone, because we know that the scenarios are different, and we also know that we've been getting weird slices of data, I'll put it that way. I also know that, unless I'm mistaken, every utility submits a plan to the PUC about reliability and readiness and preparedness, and they need to be reviewed and approved by the PUC, but perhaps a different level of scrutiny and incorporating that information could be helpful. That isn't why I initially turned my card, but it is an important part of what I think needs to happen. I did flip my card specifically, although Patrick nailed it right away. You know, we think of energy efficiency in a broader way. Of course, there's weatherization, but demand response is really important. And I think it is what will, as I heard somebody say last week, who should know, who is part of this industry, but I cannot attribute this based on the protocols of that meeting, that it's probably what would keep the lights on if we had a storm like a winter storm Elliott. And so the Commission has the opportunity through Act 129, aside from the PJM demand response program, to really offer a more robust opportunity to think about that granularity so that resources that are intermittent, like solar, can better participate. And then the other thing that I wanted to note is this is a longer term thing, but the escalation of microgrids, which I know pulls power off of utilities, but in reality helps to balance that load and that resource reliability and resilience overall of operations. And there are a number of institutions that want to do it. You heard some complaints voiced earlier about sometimes there are barriers to being able to interconnect to the grid. And even though a microgrid inherently is not connected, there are operations that want to only be able to isolate and become an island when needed. So I think more of that. And lastly, you know, virtual power plants, right? Christine also mentioned this, but batteries, long duration storage for batteries, the ability for the entire Commonwealth's mix of electric providers to be able to pull from that storage when needed in the event of a critical, a severe storm, right? Which we know weirdly, although the winter storms have far more deleterious impact on families, the most severe storms have been in the spring, where the damage to assets and wires and poles that are above ground has happened. So I would also second Christine's point about hardening the distribution with reconductoring and other opportunities and very dynamic line power flow. There's a lot that can be done with what we have today, is I guess what I'm trying to convey, and that the commission is uniquely positioned because you're not in the mindset of a utility with a utility business model that confines them in certain ways, so they can't, be driven to incent things that remove additional throughput, even though by decoupling we tried to do that. But there's still a kind of an asset-based bias inherent, but also that PJM should not control the rates and data entirely for the Commonwealth. And so I'm, again, encouraged that you're holding this proceeding and hope that you will do more. Thanks.
Janine, I had a follow-up question for you on demand response, and we have heard this before in terms of requiring a demand response program in Act 129. Is that appropriate since it's openly traded on PJM market? Should it be a required program in Act 129 because it's being traded already in the open market?
So are you saying that it shouldn't be because it's duplicative and it's a double payment?
That's what I'm asking. That's what some would say. I personally think that, energy efficiency, this is the last time you want to get rid of energy efficiency programs, as we're having these issues with resource adequacy. This is the worst time to do that. But some may say because it is openly traded in the marketplace, should it be a requirement of Act 129?
I think that those who participate can choose to participate in PJM. They are not required, and they could participate in the state as well. And so we would like to see both. We would not like to see it discontinued at all. And I would agree with your notion that now is not the time to get rid of that kind of resource, but in fact have more of it. We need way more distributed energy resources, whether it's batteries or virtual power plants or rooftop solar or CHP or whatever it might be. We need to incorporate that as part of how we're thinking about the overall availability of energy to customers in order to ensure that reliability and affordability above all, and security. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Janine. Tori?
Yeah, so at First Energy, obviously, we impressed in our initial remarks about the fact that timing is of paramount importance here. And so there are going to be the solutions that are longer range and larger undertakings, and then there are the things that many folks at this panel have been talking about that are lower hanging fruit. When we look at what we believe solutions are, the Winter Storm Elliott example is a perfect one in highlighting two critical things that we think are very important, and that is focusing on what's in the best interest of customers, meaning get that reliability, but do it affordably, as Janine points out, and doing so as expeditiously as possible. That is going to necessitate us taking an all of the above approach. And while First Energy does not believe that DER, energy efficiency, some of those types of solutions are going to solve the problem at large, they are critical components when we think of that all of the above effort. David had spoken to the resource planning side of things and encouraged that, and that's something that we also strongly encourage. But one of the things that strikes me as I sit here listening to everything and we've prepared our remarks is the fact that we started this deregulated construct 20 years ago. And we talked about a lot of things, including the behavioral aspects that are part of what we're hearing in response to your question, many years ago, and not necessarily through the lens of the technology that we know we have today in AMI, the second gen of AMI that's on its way, all of the things coming out of FERC Order 2222 that is going to be up to the states and the folks in this room to figure out solutions for, which are really going to be an opportunity if we want to look at them that way. And those types of behavioral things are the low-hanging fruit that we can grab now to be able to solve for those types of things on a more immediate term basis, while we, yes, might need to see legislation coming down the pike. But one of the things that that I think we need to be really thoughtful about is, even when it comes to resource planning, Janine does point out accurately that there is a reporting obligation annually for EDCs today. But that reporting obligation was established in the construct of a fully integrated market or design within Pennsylvania. And so many of the things that we are living with as our current construct were designed for times that are different than we're living in today, technology that's different than we're living in today, and markets that are different than we have today. And so those are things that holistically, I believe we need to take a look at and start really itemizing what we can accomplish now, what we need to put as that secondary tier. And I do want to underscore the fact that the commission is in an amazing position as a thought leader on this set of topics in a way that is, also to Janine's point, not biased or perceived to be biased in any way, unlike literally everybody else sitting here. And so what that creates in terms of opportunity for the commission to lead the education, not only to the general public, but to the major decision makers and stakeholders that are going to have a big say in this, but perhaps don't understand these issues in the same way that all of us in the room today do. Getting them to the table, getting them educated as a trusted voice in the industry, I think is going to be hypercritical in your future, all of our future.
That's the common set of facts.
Okay. Thank you, Tori. That's really helpful. So, what we're looking at right now with the data centers that are coming online and bringing that demand and those very large loads, what do our EDCs need to do with regard to their tariffs, with regard to rates for these very unique customers? Patrick.
Well, I'm going to use this question to talk about what I want, like any good panelist. But I think it addresses the issue, and that is what can the Public Utility Commission kind of require now? First of all, I really completely agree with this question about integrated resource assessment. Like, that should be happening, and it should be happening across EDC service territories, right? It should not just be in your own little footprint, right? There's got to be some level of coordination, because like these things neighbor each other, right? You know, like our EDC territories neighbor each other. And to that end, under the Public Utility Code, under Section 2807 E5, E5 gives the opportunity for the Public Utility Commission and for EDCs to enter into contracts with large peak loads. And so these contracts they're a part of default service procurement, but they're not bound by the same prudent mix standard or the durational standard of only 25% of the load and or 20 years. E5I talks about where there's 15 megawatts of peak load at any 1 meter, an EDC can propose to enter into a contract to serve that entity. So you could have EDC constructs under the default service load that really look different than the rest of the default service mix that may be happening in the context of default service supply. This really gets at a policy question about behind the meter, in front of the meter. What does that look like? Maybe it doesn't work for all loads because they have other agreements, but you could also have kind of leadership from the Public Utility Commission that requires coordination among EDCs for the siting of some of this or the procurement of new generation to serve this new load. Because although 2807 E5 at least little I, doesn't say EDCs can own generation, right? It does allow for this contracting and this broad level of contracting. And I think that like we can't miss that opportunity, right? There is, through bilateral contracts, this ability to procure and secure existing load, but also incentivize new load if we look out the horizon a little more. And so I just really want to focus us back on 2807. The existing policies allow for up to 25% of default service contracts to be long-term PPAs. The existing construct allows the commission to make a determination that it could be more than 25%. If in fact it still looks at what it still meets the least cost over time standard. That least cost over time standard, right, should not be fixed in time, right? It does evolve. You know, we have to deal with the markets as they are now. So what's the time horizon we're looking at? So the question of how much load can be procured through long-term PPAs, I think there's room for commission discretion. The duration of those contracts, although the statute says 4 to 20 years, allows for the commission under certain circumstances to go broader than that. And what we have not done is require coordination between the EDCs, right? These two folks sitting to my left have service territories that are adjacent to each other. So does Tory and PPL's company, right? So you have, you know, the former MedEd territory right next to the PPL territory, right? Penelac right next to Duquesne. If you're talking about coordinated default service plans that could contract for long-term PPAs to site new generation longer into the future, that creates this opportunity not only to deal with hyperscale load issues that are particularly situated in an area, but also for resource adequacy in general. But all of that goes back to David's first point, which is we need some level of foresight into what load forecasting is happening, what resource adequacy is happening. And I would submit this is squarely within the Public Utility Commission's responsibility and obligation under existing Chapter 28 of the Public Utility Commission. It defines reliability as requiring a look at adequacy, and it defines adequacy as having sufficient generation, right? So within our existing construct and within our existing responsibilities for providing reliable service, it kind of compels the PUC, I think, to look at some of these issues. So there's buckets here. There's lots that I kind of threw out there, but I think there's lots of ways in which we can think about this. But it does require, I think, the commission to put some policy markers out there to say these are some things we want you EDCs to think about, do, coordinate on, and prepare for.
Thank you very much. Your thoughts on that reminded me of something Stu Bressler said this morning about the PJM markets at their core being designed around bilateral trades and self-supply at times. Who's next? I do believe it's Susan. Oh, God, it's all of you. We're going to come back around this way.
Yeah, it's everyone. So on the question of the large single point loads, you know, I think that this is a space where certainly these are loads, you know, and I represent a lot of very large loads, but when you start talking about some of these data center loads, it's like a quantum. It's a quantum increase. And so they are, I think, a bit unique, and we need to have some a thoughtful approach to how they get incorporated into our markets. And I think they've certainly the resource adequacy dynamics that Glenn talked about. I think that, you know, when you add in the hyperscalers, I think it does lend to think about perhaps some additional guardrails around the assessments. I really like some of that conversation there. But I think sort of the foundational question of how a data center becomes a retail customer in the Commonwealth is something that requires some thought. We know that there is a lot of effort being done, a lot of development work that, they're shopping different EDCs, they're shopping different states. And one of my big concerns representing large customers is we start planning and building for loads that do not materialize and that are not here for the long haul, because that is when you look at loads like this is not normal load growth. This is not even a normal load growth, including a new steel mill. I mean, it's very, very large. So I think thinking about sort of a certification process and having common rules across the different EDCs, it would be great to see it across the footprint so that we know when PJM's developing its load forecast that we're not counting things twice, and we understand how much skin in the game the data center load has. That might be an overreach. So I will just say this is something that's squarely within the Commission's bailiwick, and having sort of that coordination and common rules of the road. So if, for example, and Duquesne makes an adjustment to its forecast with PJM, we know that load is not also being counted with an adjustment that another EDC is making. So I think that is an area that I would also put it as low-hanging fruit, but it's an important thing to get started on, and it can happen pretty quickly. And I think it could feed into some of these assessments that have been discussed here longer term. So appreciate the consideration of that.
Okay, I'm actually going to change the order because we just heard from you guys. Start with Janine, work back this way.
I only had something very small, honestly. So Tori, I did want to note all of the above. We agree, right? We do need all of the above. And then regarding the hyperscalers, right? They are their own special animal. I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis. This is not, my area of expertise, but simply noting that there are cases across the country looking at should they be treated differently. And there are others who think that you should price based on how the energy is used, right? Whether maybe the inductive capacitive resistance versus, who the user is. But I think the Commission needs to expend energy on this, and I think Susan had some very good cautions there. And lastly, if more generation is needed, I don't intend to suggest that we oppose it, and actually wanted to call out that there are models in other countries. Canada, I believe, backstops investment. Pretty much their utility commission requires the utilities to step up and ensure generation and invest in it, but backstops that investment if it turns out that it's not needed. Hence, again, back to load forecasting being critical. But there are models of investment of public dollars that may make sense, and the invite for the panel used the word legislative as one of the questions under this panel, which I thought was intriguing because clearly, the PUC is not a legislative body, but is able to signal or convey to the legislature what they think are the needs for the Commonwealth, right? And that's an important role as well. That's it.
Yeah, a couple comments, maybe first starting where Patrick started around power purchase agreements. I think just to be cognizant of the fact that long-term power purchase agreements have an impact on utilities' balance sheet and credit ratings, and that has an impact directly on the cost of debt and the cost of equity which customers bear. So that there are ways to do power purchase agreements that it's not imputed as debt on a utility balance sheet and therefore stays credit neutral. But those are more complex arrangements, but certainly have been done in lots of other states, lots of other jurisdictions, and we have seen them done. So certainly something to do, but I think it's something we need to keep in mind if we're going to talk about long-term power purchase agreements for whatever reason. Directly to the question about, do we need tariffs or rate design for these large data centers? And I'll say in our region, the Philadelphia region, we've begun to see kind of an influx of interest. And, we have some existing tariffs that may be applicable, existing rate design. But as we look at it, we think that we need to make some changes and modifications to that. In the interim, to make sure that customers are protected, of course, as the data centers come, we've required deposits for any sort of investment we're going to make in order to serve them, right, just up front. But we've been looking not just at PECO, but across all of Exelon's footprint, is like, what is the right way to handle this so we don't expose customers? Should a customer either, bail at some point because they found a better site, they decided not to build, or even once they come online and we've made significant investment in the rest of our transmission system, let's say, and the load doesn't materialize, how do we protect customers from us having reinforced the system for a customer that's now vanished? And we've looked at, other utilities like AEP have filed tariffs, and some of our tariffs have a revenue test, that gets paid back over time. So there are different ways of handling that, but I do think we need to look at it. Doing one-off contracts, if you have one customer is, kind of doable. But as you begin to get multiple customers who want the same sort of service, I think it's more efficient to, at least, even if there are slight modifications, to have a general tariff that covers it. And then the last point I'll make is we've talked to different data centers. Speed is everything. So they want certainty today. So having a contract that we have to come to the commission to get approval for, they're not that they're not interested in it, but they'd much rather say, tell me what the price is today. I signed the contract. I'm ready to go. I don't want to wait to get it.
Before we move to Glenn, David, with regard to interconnecting these large loads, earlier in the day we talked to some generators and they said equipment and supply chain issues are a problem for them. Do you see the same for the equipment on the distribution side and on the transmission side of the business?
Yeah, so I think primarily on the transmission side, there are, whether it's circuit breakers, some of these very large power transformers, long lead times. And one of the things, one thing we've done is we reserve production slots with different suppliers through the next several years, and have at the moment an excess, if you will, for some of the key equipment again, so that we're not going to have to wait we have a queue, might be 3 years from now, but we've got a place in the queue. We've also been talking as a company, again, because of our larger footprint, can we standardize on certain equipment so we can, not that we're going to pre-stock it, if you will, but if we have to order 230 kV breakers, if we don't need them, BG&E, Pepco, ACE, Delmar, somebody else can use them, and that way we can also cut down the lead time.
Glenn.
Yeah, thanks. A couple thoughts. Responding to Susan on load forecast, she raises some excellent points, and actually she caused me to put number 8 on my to-do list, and that is, developing a real expertise inside the commission on load forecasting, I think would be a helpful resource. I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion going on the load forecasting right now. There could be some duplication. In fact, a bunch of consumer advocates, Patrick was not one of them, but a bunch of them filed a complaint at FERC last week saying that PJM is chronically over-forecasting demand. So I think there's a lot of questions, and to the extent the commission can drill down there and get an independent view on that, I think it would be helpful. I also agree with Patrick on the idea that if you're going to look to a spot where you might be able to affect some change, it's in the provider of last resort policy. There's some things that might be done there. But let me maybe throw out a caution as you think about that, because I think David raises some really valid concerns as it relates to that. And also, I think you got to get comfortable with how you would, what some of those pricing, mechanisms will look like for contracts that long. Very hard to predict natural gas prices 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. What you could be signing up there might be more than what you're bargaining for. And let me throw out one more war story on this, just because I think it's an instructive example about how these markets are cyclical, and you got to be careful where you go. It involves the Sunbury plan and actually Duquesne's provider of last resort. Were you at Duquesne?
Yep, that predated me.
All right,
That's
what I suspected. It did not predate me at the commission, though. So I remember this one very well, but it was filed by Duquesne in 2003. And basically what Duquesne said is, we want to buy, keep in mind, this is after we restructured. So this is after the restructuring plans were approved, after all the utilities had moved all their generation to either competitive affiliates or sold it off. Duquesne came to the commission and said, we would like to buy a power plant, the Sunbury power plant, and we would like to recover the costs associated with that in the provider of last resort's rates. Duquesne said it would lower bills, it would help with reliability, had a whole litany, preserve jobs. It was a very compelling case for why Pennsylvania should allow Duquesne to buy this plant and put it in their polar rates. Again, this was filed in 2003. It was a 65-year-old. It was definitely over 50. I think it was 65 when it retired, but it was an old coal plant. It was filed in 2003. The commission rejected it in 2004. There's a brilliant statement by Commissioner Thomas there. I encourage you all to take a look at that. But they rejected it for good reason, because Pennsylvania was going to competitive markets. No utilities. We don't want you buying generation and polar rates. This is not something you should be doing. Well, guess what? That plant stayed open until 2014. It was going to close, we were told, but it stayed open until 2014. It closed in 2014. A few years later, Panda came along, built the Hummel Power Station, one of the most innovative natural gas plants on the planet, 1,100 megawatts versus 400 megawatts, which the Sunbury facility was, and now sitting there in Pennsylvania, built with merchant capital, is one of the best power plants in the world and owned by LS Power currently. So my point is, again, these markets are cyclical, and sometimes they just need to allow themselves to work out. But had the commission bid on that proposal from Duquesne at the time, would that have played out? I don't know. It might have. It might not have. But my point is, sometimes you got to let these markets play out to get to the right solution. That's exactly what happened when the commission did not take the opportunity to use Polar to put a long-term asset on the backs of consumers.
Glenn, follow-up question on capacity auction. We've heard a lot this morning and heard a lot about it at OPSI, but the 3-year look ahead for capacity auction, is that the sweet spot in time? I mean, should it be extended, shortened? One of the things you said, pricing out gas, for instance, 10 years, it gets a little dicey then. And it seems to me the farther out you go, you're actually adding risk to it and you're not removing it. So what is the sweet spot then? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, we haven't had a 3-year forward auction in way too long. I mean, and so it'd be, in my view, great to get back to that so we could better answer that question. The reason 3-year was put in place in the first place, because that was the time it was thought to build a natural gas plant once you got the capacity award. I think we heard today, and I think it's right, it takes longer than that today. But as you state, it gets harder to predict further out. So I don't know. I've heard powerful arguments on both sides. 3 seems to be a comfortable middle ground that has proven workable. On my 8 to-do list, that's not on it. But I think it's something that is appropriately to continue evaluating. Is that the right number? I will say, PJM used to have a monthly and a daily market. That created enormous problems. I spent a year of my life investigating market manipulation. Susan will remember that one well. So I think there was a good reason to move from a short-term market like that to a longer-term one like 3 years. Like I said, it wouldn't be on the top of my things to address, but I think it's one to keep watching to see if that number's right. Maybe 4 is better, maybe 5 is better, maybe 2 is better. I think there's arguments to be made on both sides.
Christine.
I'm not sure what question I'm answering anymore. Let me actually start with your question, Vice Chair, around data centers, and then I'd like to touch on the Chairman's question as well, since we're expanding responses. Just on the data center, I completely agree with my colleague, Dave Velasquez, around getting tariff provisions, contracting provisions right. And I think there's opportunities to do that. We're certainly doing that as companies. Again, I think there's an opportunity for future cost of service studies and making sure that the tariffs align with use of the system. One thing, though, that I would point out is we have an opportunity to get it right, and we have a real opportunity from both a security standpoint but an economic development standpoint of having this kind of infrastructure locate in Pennsylvania. I think it's a good thing. From a rate standpoint, when those data centers, those large users are on the transmission system, it is a potentially significant reduction for other transmission users, including residential customers. So just by sheer volume, again, you've got to get the cost right, get the contracting right, but there is a real potential for that use of the system to really provide some benefits to all customers, even with even with the utility investment, the socialized investment. So I just wanted to mention that. One of the things that we also heard this morning was around data centers and kind of bringing your own generation. And there's some, I think there's some interesting thoughts there. Something though that kind of we're talking about is, our markets the solution? Are there other opportunities? Data centers bringing their own generation, utilities entering into long-term PPAs, and I guess what I would just say to kind of maybe ground us is I think there is no optimal solution. I think there are multiple solutions, and some of those need to happen in parallel. As a utility executive sitting here, we contingency plan, we identify risks, we identify single points of failure in our systems, IT systems and others. We heard reliability first refer to it as a common point of failure. I would say to you, and I'm not calling PJM's market a failure, but it is a single point of failure for resource adequacy right now. And so as we sit here and we extol virtues of one solution over another, I don't think there is one solution. And it's not all in the Commission's authority right now. It's in your obligation. It's an obligation that I also feel. But I really do think that we need to keep an open mind, not let the past dictate the future, not let a law passed almost 30 years ago define our future solely. Even if we think about generation technologies, and the gentleman who's sitting here to my right, there are new technologies, even something like storage, that wasn't contemplated 30 years ago. So when I talk about EDCs taking an active role and promoting the ability for utilities to invest in generation, I think immediately folks are thinking, oh, new business model, rate-based generation. This is not about new business models. This is about need and how we get generation located in this state, because location does matter. Dave and I both have load shedding obligations under PJM. We are not insulated from Maryland or New Jersey or Delaware or DC. We don't have that luxury. So when we think about resource adequacy and economic development and keeping the lights on, the type of generation, the location of generation does matter. And we are sitting here today, I think, in a really enviable position. We need to think to the future and not take solutions off the table before they're even well vetted and discussed, both from a policy standpoint and a legislation standpoint.
Thank you. And I think it all starts with a plan. Mentioned that this morning. Brian.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. It's nice to go last year and build on some thoughts there. I was also going to mention it's pretty incredible to hear almost everyone on that last panel saying, or the first panel, bring your own generation was a useful solution. It would, obviously would be useful to see folks also on the data center side to have that conversation. And just to bring a little bit from our conversations with those parties, a lot of them are open to that concept. A lot of them also see that as a new concept and something that they're internally, traditionally have always relied on utility power. But especially as you see more regions getting backlogged, they're looking at different solutions. We had a customer on the West Coast where it was going to take 4 or 5 years to get wires. They had to build a new substation. So we're bringing 3 megawatts of dispatchable power on site. And then when the wires get built, we'll move that away and they'll be part of the grid. So I think we're going to see more of those situations, especially you heard from David and we've talked about the speed to power is the biggest challenge. It's not the cost, it's that speed issue. And so in that case, a third party was offering a solution and working along with the utility to make sure there's a seamless integration. We see other business models like working directly with utilities, where the utilities are going to own the bring your own generation. When you look at Georgia Power has a new tariff where they can own the on-site power for their data center customers. Atlanta's a huge hub. And then we also, a third model we see is these hyperscalers actually buying that bring your own generation, then picking it up and moving it when they don't need it anymore to their new location. So we have a number of customers that we're safe harboring right now with the ITC where they don't know where they're going to put it, but they know they're having speed to power challenges. And so they've put in big orders, and they're going to see where they need it in 2 years. So it's definitely a creative time, and I think Pennsylvania is just at like the front end of this. So hopefully it's good you're convening a lot of this conversation.
Thank you. Tori.
Yeah, so I earlier mentioned that we had certain criteria that at First Energy we're viewing as critical to being components of solving for this challenge. And when I think about the question asked about data centers and some of the other remarks I've heard here, it brings me to the third, because I already mentioned customers and timing, but the third really is sufficient risk mitigation. And when we think about that, we're thinking about it not only for us at First Energy, but for all of the players that we're involved with, whether it's the customers, the power producers that we might be partnered with, or the data centers. And we've heard here today several remarks about the fact that speed to implementation is critical. Cost is not as much of an issue, which is a unique space for us to find ourselves in. It might be the first I've ever seen it. But along with that, certainty for everybody involved, whether it's it actually materializing, whether it's the generation that's going to need to support it actually materializing, whether it's the constructability of the power lines that we're going to need to put in place that may not exist today, because these are loads that, at least for the First Energy territories, in some instances are popping up in places that haven't been high load centers for us historically, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and developing rules of the road that are consistent and reliable for everybody involved, I think there is real merit in. We are looking across our system right now at all of our tariffs and trying to make sure that what we are seeing in the build out of service to those customers is not being undertaken on the backs of our other customers, because that is a very real concern for us. And I'm sure others here. But at the same time, doing it in a way that is effective and fits within the jurisdictional models is also very important. I also want to just mention that, when we think about being able to meet the load needs, we've heard some talk about the default service construct in Pennsylvania, and we are very much in favor of finding ways to encourage new dispatchable generation to come online that would be a complement to all of the other solutions in the all of the above approach. When I commented to the last question, I said something to the effect that our construct, as we've known it, as we're operating under it today, was built 20 years ago with the advent of deregulation. And as we've moved through the various policy changes about how it is that we're implementing default service in Pennsylvania, it's really been with the notion of constantly encouraging the development of the retail market, especially for the smaller classes of customers. As we look at today's challenges, I think about it as a yes and, because all of that is still there, but at the same time, in fostering that, we've moved away from the long-range planning. We've gone to very short-term contracts compared to where we even started default service in its first programs, and we've really moved away from that in ways that the law would allow for us to expand upon. And the reality is it's going to be very hard to get generators to really want to invest, and we heard this earlier today, without us having predictability in the contract durations, which in turn, in order for us to meet the current least cost standard, I personally believe is going to require us revisiting whether, say, a 4-year program term is sufficient, because we're only looking out 4 years. And to the integrated resource planning concept that was talked about earlier, it also seems to me that that is a piece of a conversation that has never been brought into the default service program planning process, but needs to be. And so that's something that I would just highlight, but all with the caution that we look at those on behalf of our non-shopping customers as EDCs. And one of the other major characteristics that we have concerns at First Energy about is ensuring that we're adopting a beneficiary pays methodology. And again, that extends to everybody involved. And what we don't want to see happening is us expand those programs, us think about them longer term, but only do so on the backs of our non-shopping customers. And only our customers that are actual ratepayers. And so that's something that I think we need to collectively talk about and think of solutions to within that space.
On that last piece about us being myopic about the non-shopping
Sure.
customers versus the shopping customers.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example when I think about the First Energy program, we have our PTC rider, which collects the portions that are the generation components, all the costs of those contracts that are standing ready to serve for any customer who becomes non-shopping. We meanwhile have our default service support rider, which is the mechanism through which we recover all of the costs that are otherwise treated as non-bypassable. And that has been a very active conversation over the years that many folks in this room have been part of. I think the way that we've looked at it historically has been within that construct of supporting development of the retail market, whereas what we're looking at thinking of today and moving beyond this is going to be, how do we create the most supportive program for our customers who are going to need that generation, who are going to need that capacity over the long term? And when we're looking at it from a long-term planning standpoint, I'm not sure that entering into all of these long-term contracts, which I do believe needs to start happening, but doing so strictly with our non-shopping customers bearing the cost of that is the model that necessarily supports the Commonwealth at large.
When I played Little League Baseball, I often batted ninth because I wasn't a very good hitter, so I'm batting ninth now. So I'm going to try to answer the chairman's question first. I want to respond to the DSP, and then I'll answer the data center question. So let's start with the big picture with respect to what's going on in the capacity market. I think for the commission's purpose, the thing to keep in mind is, you can't control it. You can't even really influence it. I think as you saw from the first panel this morning, there's a whole host of people that are involved in this. PJM has their own, governance function, and they have over 1,000 stakeholders that are involved with that, and everybody's fighting about what the capacity market should be and how long it should be, and maybe that'll work out okay, and it'll solve the reliability problem, and it'll do it most affordably, and that needs to go down that track. It needs to go down that path. But the PUC, and in fact, those of us sitting around the table, we can't ultimately make those decisions. So the question for you is, while that's going on, are you going to sit by and see how that plays out? And I think what you're hearing from us is there's a sense of urgency. You can't sit around and wait to see what PJM does. We can all advocate and try to influence there, but what's within our control? So we talked about the integrated resource assessments. And now the panel has raised this issue about, can we do longer-term contracts, and what does that look like? And that is clearly within your authority. So whether it's the EDCs or some other sort of group coming to you and saying, listen, we'd like to run some type of an auction and see what the results are from those auctions, and we may find from that, hey, that doesn't work. We get super high prices or nobody wants to participate. Or we may find, oh no, it appears to be competitive compared to what's otherwise going on in the market. So I think what is within your control is to facilitate, and Tori raises this point of who's going to benefit from that? Is that all customers? But we need to go down that path, and we need to do that now simultaneously with what's going on in the capacity market to see how that's going to play out. To the chairman's question, and I'm surprised this hasn't been raised today, talking about facts and figures. For that 25-26 capacity auction, Pennsylvania customers are going to pay an additional $2.2 billion, right? You've heard that number before. And so from an affordability standpoint, that's a big number. And so from a reliability standpoint, are our customers really getting the benefit associated with that? You heard from the panels this morning that, look, it's a 3 or 4 year period to bring new generation on. So it's one thing to pay additional dollars to keep generation from retiring, but it's a different sort of paradigm as to what you need to incentivize for this new generation. And so part of this, I think, from our perspective is there should be a capacity market to keep generation from retiring, but there should be a separate capacity market with sort of higher payments that would be to incentivize new generation to come on. The other piece of that is recognize the generators don't get paid that capacity payment until they're actually online. So if they're not coming online till 29, 30, 31, that's when Pennsylvania customers should be paying those higher dollars for the benefit of that additional generation. Paying for it in 25, 26, 27, and 28 is not bringing new generation on. So is that really the most affordable approach for customers? And again, we can't control that. That's going to go on at PJM. But again, from an affordability, reliability standpoint, I think that needs to be the balance. And then on the data center piece, I think what we're seeing is the data center potential owners or developers, I think they recognize, I'll use this term, they need to pay their fair share, right? They're not going to ride the system for free, the transmission system for free. And so I think each of the EDCs need to make sure that both our distribution and our transmission tariffs, particularly the transmission tariffs, are set up so that those data centers are in fact paying their fair share. And again, we've talked about how high the load is, but we haven't talked numbers. So if the data center is going to be 300 megawatts, that's the equivalent, and this is lawyer math I use because it's just sort of directional, that's 300,000 residential houses. It's a huge number. And so if you think about taking 300,000 houses and putting on the transmission system, is there capacity for that in a particular place, and who's going to pay for that? So that's the challenges that we need to work through. And I think as Dave from PECO said, as opposed to Dave from Duquesne Light, we're making sure as those developers are coming in, we're having them pay as they go, right? So that they're investing dollars in the transmission planning that we're doing for them to make sure that they're real and they're not just sort of speculating.
Dave, one of the questions that or a follow-up question to that, and it was something I believe that came out during the first panel, but what I heard was, this is the cost of it. I'm concerned about cost because, we have ratepayers today that can't afford today's prices. We're going to have more ratepayers not be able to afford tomorrow's prices thanks to that $2.2 billion in the last auction. And then we hear, well, new generation's even above that. Are we pricing people out of affordability to pay for electricity?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that's where sort of the energy efficiency and the DERs need to be coming and be part of that solution. But as the panel this morning said, there's going to be a point in time where customers are going to have to pay for the new generation. It's making sure they're paying for the new generation at that time, and they're not paying more than that. And that's what the market's designed to do. Whether it's going to do it or not, still sort of remains to be seen. So in the meantime, what are the plans B and what are the plans C? But the costs associated with it are going to be a real challenge, but they're real. They're not going away.
Just a reminder on the tools in our toolbox, Act 129, energy efficiency, et cetera. It's incumbent upon you guys to, when you file your plans, include all of these wonderful ideas that you keep bringing up. Please. Yes. We will read them. Promise. Okay. Patrick.
Yeah, I just want to react to some of the things that Tori and Dave just said. I completely agree with Tori's assessment that, there's a really open question about if we're doing long-term PPAs, who benefits, right, and who should pay. And I think that there's this bucket of concerns that probably are not within the legislative authority of the Public Utility Commission currently, but that could be flagged by the Commission for the General Assembly. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to make the changes that we can, including but not limited to default service related issues, Act 129 related issues. And I guess I would push back a little bit. I think it's great for each of the EDCs to identify these things. I think the Commission has to put some thumbs on the scales of what they want to signal in terms of resource adequacy. So you're the ones who are going to have to say to the EDCs, we want to see default service plans that look out and have some reliability attributes associated with them. We want to see creative ideas in this. We want to see some level of consistency. Here are the things we want each of you to do. We have currently, some EDCs that have default service plans from 2025 to 2029, some that have them from 2027 to 2031, right? Maybe making sure they're all on the same path, right, might require some of those that are off kilter to get back on kilter, and then prodding a little bit about some of these issues, right? So really taking a look at what you can do within the kind of ambit of the code currently makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to leave the retail market out of this too, because there are things that you can do, right, in terms of what the retail market can do to complement this. An example is, right now, a fixed rate contract is defined by the Public Utility Commission as 3 months or longer. You could have kind of retail market reform that is in parallel with default service plan proceeding reform or procurement that aligns those better, right? I heard Travis up here talking today about longer term contracts are better. I completely agree, unless suppliers drop customers, right? Because of the uncertainties associated with the wholesale market, right? So creating avenues and greater protections for that not to happen, and/or for there to be kind of rules around that. So we're focused a lot on resource adequacy in terms of what we can't control. What we can control is default service procurement, recommendations to the General Assembly that complement retail market reform that might be needed, including, I would suggest, retail market reform that looks at whether or not mass market customers are best served by the retail market, or whether or not those customers are best served by default service procured by the EDC over longer periods of time for not only affordability, right, but for purposes of reliability and ensuring that the customer base that's paying for some of this is not able to, cost evade by shopping or doing something else. So there's just lots here, and I think that the commission can't compel a lot of it, but it also shouldn't underestimate its ability to use its bully pulpit to cajole some of it, even if you can't compel it.
Thank you. Susan?
Thanks. I also was wanting to react to Tori's, I think, helpful comments in terms of thinking about the long-term contracts, and, agree, certainly from an industrial perspective, we follow the principles of cost causation as well as beneficiary pays as being organizing principles for markets as well as regulated services. But sort of thinking about the long-term contracts, I think the one word of caution, and I think that we've talked a lot about the cyclical parts of markets. I would also say the pendulum. So there's lots of examples of good and bad and ugly. And I won't say which one I would put this bucket in, but it's not the good one, is thinking about like PERPA contracts, long-term PERPA contracts. Those become hangovers. So sort of as we do this, I think there are some lessons that can be learned from the past to avoid putting diversification, I think, is a key thing that I think many customers would think is good, prudent decision-making. And I think it leads in, it complements well sort of these concepts of independent assessments, because we'd love to see more work done in terms of understanding how generation, demand resources, and transmission planning fit in together. Right now, because of the staging of how PJM markets occur, transmission's always going to be the solution, and might not be the lowest cost solution. And I think that the points around affordability, from the smallest to the customers to larger customers that are employers, we have to think about can people pay these bills, and thinking about how we rationalize some of these spends. They're enormous amounts of money. So just making sure that we can, as an economy, survive it, I think is super important. So thanks.
Thanks, Susan. I was looking at Pennsylvania rates, our rates for the different customer classes. And obviously, you've been doing something right for your customers in that you guys are, I want to say you're paying probably half of what residential customers are paying, all in, the all-in price.
So I would again go back to cost causation principles and the costs associated with serving a larger load versus smaller loads. I mean, I think that those are important principles, and they're certainly, I think, founded in terms of, when you look at unit rates, but I would challenge looking at a large bill for an industrial. Those are pretty significant numbers. So, I mean, your point's well taken, but I think it does go back to what are those principles that we have rate making, cost of service, or sort of thinking about beneficiary pays, cost causation, sort of all being part of it. And, one of the things with markets, actually, LMPs are LMPs. The days of those, it can be there's not a volume discount. The LMP price is still the LMP price for me as a residential customer as it is for a large industrial.
Okay, thank you. Janine, did you have your card up before? Okay. Yeah, we're getting short on time. So I'm going to go Glenn,
Right.
Christine, Brian, and anyone who has any last comments to make. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
I'll respond to a few things and then combine my final thoughts, so you don't have to call me twice. So just a couple of thoughts. First of all, congratulations to the commission. I think this was a terrific day. I think you all should be congratulated for putting it together. I look at what other states have done, and this was an incredibly thoughtful conversation today, and you all should be applauded for it. I see a lot of the staff folks here. Good job, folks. That leads me to my first do on my list. Let's do this again, like 6 months to a year. I think having these conversations, these dialogues are important. I know they're probably a pain to put together. Staff is probably about ready to shoot me here. But I think, having these regular conversations with the folks that are in this room, because let's face it, a lot of the same interests that are represented here today were the same ones that put this together in the first place in terms of the restructuring effort. And a lot of the success that we've had in Pennsylvania is because the utilities, the suppliers, the consumers, the environmental advocates have been able to get together with the commissioners and pound out solutions. A couple thoughts. One, I think it's pretty important to be cognizant of what we don't know right now that could have a huge impact on this whole question moving forward. First of all, federal environmental regulations. It's been mentioned a couple times today, change of administration. There could be significant changes to the environmental regulations governing power plants in Pennsylvania and every other state in this country. That could bring 10, 15,000 megawatts back on the system pretty darn quickly. That's been in PJM's projected retirements. I think that's important to keep in mind. We heard a lot of ideas today, RRI, the idea that we can fast track resources through the process. Chances are we're going to be sitting here a year from now with that have been, approved by FERC, hopefully, and maybe we'll see some projects that actually can say, hey, we did this. We came on the grid because this process was available to us. You heard ELCC mentioned a bunch today. I firmly believe, particularly from a Pennsylvania standpoint, there's progress to be made in ELCC that can benefit Pennsylvania enormously. The way ELC is written, CC rules are written right now, and PJM has acknowledged they got to address it. It's particularly punitive to Pennsylvania gas. And you can look at the numbers that bear this out. I think there's some reforms that can be made, probably in relatively short order. PJM's talking about this year that can bring more megawatts of gas into the reliability equation without even building any more plants. The reference unit. PJM's going to put in front of FERC within the next 3 weeks a change to the reference unit. I'm not going into the details of what it means, but what it means is the capacity market offer cap is going to go down dramatically, and there's going to be more slope in the demand curve, which means less volatility. It's a good filing. It's good for consumers. As far as I know, consumers and suppliers are on the same page on that. I guess we all got to see the details. I don't want to speak for my friends on the other side of the table, but I think it's important to let those type of initiatives play themselves out. The other thing we don't know really yet is what the market response has been to the higher prices. I mean, we've seen some early indicators that the market has responded. We've seen the Illinois units that withdrew their with retirement. We saw the deal with TMI. We see Calpine's announcements. We see LS's announcement. We're seeing activity suggest that there has been a response. Will we continue to see those responses? I think we really don't know the end of that story yet. And keep in mind, I mean, this is the first capacity clear since 2018 that really was, a signal to the market to either build or stay in the market. So it's been a long time since we've seen a market clear like that. We're seeing some market response. I think we'll see more. The other thing I would mention too, state laws, SIEGES. SIEGES is a great example. Governor Pritzker wakes up tomorrow and decides he wants to, keep 11,000 megawatts of gas on the system. He could probably do that and tell the legislature to pass the law accordingly. So, keep in mind that, one single act by one single state policymaker could have that type of impact. So with all that said, like I said, number one on my do list is keep having these conversations, stay principled, stay educated, and probably the number one don't is, don't succumb to the pressure that we've seen other states succumb to. I mean, I talked about that New Jersey example earlier in 2010. New Jersey succumbed to that pressure. Maryland succumbed to that pressure. Pennsylvania did not. Pennsylvania said, don't bring those arguments to us. And it was the right move at the time. Had that law not been in the Constitution or unconstitutional, like I said, New Jersey ratepayers would be out over $1 billion over the course of those contracts. Maryland, there was only one plant in Maryland, but it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. ZECs are another good example where that argument was brought to Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania said no. Ratepayers in all the states, Illinois, New Jersey, that approved ZECs, out hundreds of millions of dollars from plants that would have stayed on the system otherwise. So I don't want to get into that, but my point is there's value to being patient. There's value not to biting on some of these arguments and panicking because, look at what is happening with New Jersey and offshore wind right now. First movers tend to get punished, especially with new technology. That's been the history. Susan mentioned the PURPA contracts. We spent decades getting consumers out of those PURPA contracts. We paid some developers hundreds of millions of dollars to go away without putting a shovel in the ground. It was not a good chapter. It was both bad and ugly, to your analogy. So we want to avoid those things. So I'll stop there. I'll put my written comments. But again, thank you to you all, the commissioners, and thank you to the staff for putting this together. I think it's a very terrific day.
Thank you. Christine?
Yeah, thank you. So just let me start with long-term contracts since that was some point of discussion. I just want to add, I think that long-term contracts, whether default service or beyond default service, certainly could play a role in both helping existing generation, also bringing new generation to the state. I think as we have that conversation, though, we also need to talk about appropriate guardrails. We've talked about the PURPA contracts and potential costs or contracts that look good at the outset that may not look good 10 to 15 years from now. I would also say that we need to consider certainly the customers, but also I would say also our utility share owners. A number of those counterparties are not necessarily creditworthy counterparties, so I do think we need to talk about what those appropriate guardrails are for long-term contracts, but I think that they could have a place. I don't think it's something that is insurmountable. I would recommend the commission look to states like Michigan and Indiana and how they have dealt with long-term contracts to incentivize new generation. The other thing I would just mention is around, kind of in concluding comments, around diversification. So how do we bring diversification to our generation portfolio and our ancillary services? Are there resources that the market won't select, that the market won't incent? Perhaps they don't pass kind of the test in the energy markets or the capacity markets, but they are equally as important. And so I would suggest that as we think about places that the commission could provide expertise and advocacy, I do think that that's a place to consider is whether there are other technologies that need to be brought to bear for diversification. On that kind of sticking with that point, PBL Corporation has more than 150 research and development projects underway actively now. Those 150 projects have brought $100 million in federal funding to our states, to our projects. There are a few of those in Pennsylvania, a few of those in Rhode Island. Most of them are in Kentucky and associated with our regulated generation. So I would just say that there is an R&D component here, whether it's in environmental technologies, whether it's in some of the less competitive technologies. There is a benefit to research and development, both from a how do we diversify our resources, how do we bring those technologies to bear in our state, but also from a growth potential, right, an innovation potential. So I wanted to bring that up because I think it's not something that we've talked about, but I think that there is a real opportunity for EDCs to play a role. Again, would require some legislative changes, but there are other things I think we should think broadly when we think about generation and generation technologies. And then finally, I would just thank the commission and, I think all the panelists today really brought some good ideas, good solutions. I think there was a lot of honest discussion. You heard a lot of opinions, and certainly we appreciated being part of it and look forward to continued discussions.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you very much. And I'll wrap up my thoughts too with a few lasting tidbits and some things I wanted to share but I didn't get to. So again, thank you for having us. I would agree that this is the right forum and probably the beginning rather than the end. And it sounds like that's where you're heading. Like I said, our company's investing along with Pennsylvania and federal support, $174 million in the state to manufacture dispatchable generation, in part because, to there's point, we're part of a pool here. So what happens here and what happens elsewhere really has an effect everywhere. I'm, as a ratepayer here in Pennsylvania, certainly concerned about the challenges despite our exporting power. So a few points. It sounds like there's a lot of ideas here about short-term and kind of longer-term work streams. Just to take the example of Texas, where I work a lot, you still see a lot of the work happening that is a result of Uri, and that was over 3 years ago, right? And I know you spent a lot of time talking to your colleagues, and so hopefully, we don't have to wait for another crisis. But I think better decisions happen before crises in general than while, and some of the work I'm doing there, I see folks maybe wishing they had thought through things without a tragedy like that. So certainly support thinking about things as short, medium, and long-term initiatives. One thing that was on a prior panel that I wish I had thought about was really about how states can play a role in requiring dual fuels. You asked about what we could have done to avoid, there were 90 gigawatts of outages, correlated outages. I'm not convinced that we've solved that problem yet. And markets have trouble with these kind of high impact, low frequency events, right? And so I think PJM has considered requiring that kind of dual fuel, but hasn't really gone there. There's 13 plus states to consider, and minimum standards like that you saw in Texas adopting a more strict winter reliability standard than we have here now, for instance. So something to consider that Pennsylvania has control over. We talked about rate making. Certainly excited about maybe how this conversation will play into Act 129, and certainly support more initiatives that think creatively about how, if you have a relatively small group of customers using a lot of power, is Act 129, how does that address that challenge? Traditionally, Act 129 does think about big users, but it's mostly about a large program. You have to obviously think about cross subsidization, but maybe there's some at least ways to support best practices. Data centers are certainly efficient, but there's probably more that they can do. And then really finally with PJM, the RRI initiative, it's a temporary solution. I think you heard that today. It's a one-off. But these problems aren't going to go away. We see other regions actually addressing these through long-term solutions where if you have more reliability to bring as a generator, you actually get prioritized in the queue. And does that mean we shouldn't build any, standalone solar? No, but we have to think about maybe there's a longer-term solutions as well. And I would just encourage you through your important influence at PJM. I know that's something they've started to think about, but haven't really opened that door yet. So thanks a lot, and appreciate your hosting us.
Thank you. Janine?
Yeah, I just have some sort of miscellaneous, not exactly closing comments, but things we haven't hit on today. Under Act 129, kind of the bizarre irony of the PJM price spike is that things that didn't previously meet the cost test may now. And so I know the Commission will soon be issuing an order asking the utilities to file their plans. It would be great for the Commission to give some thought to the cost test, and I recognize that you are have to operate within the confines of what's in the law to have a 15-year test, but to creatively consider how that cost test can be constructed to encourage more projects that may not have made the cut previously. Secondly, the other thing under Act 129 is that it's sort of not structured optimally, to be blunt, but it is what it is. So it would be wonderful to see the Commission call upon the utilities to do an analysis of the data, which I suspect they already do, if I had to guess, of where they see the best opportunities, which don't always line up with what is allowed in the program. For example, there's $396 million coming to the state under the RISE PA program, right? There are to help decarbonize industrial concerns. There's something like 14,000 small manufacturers amongst that across the Commonwealth. I'd have to guess that none of those folks have a certified energy manager or the sophisticated kind of energy management that a large industrial customer might. And something as simple as power factor is something that the utilities are in a far better position to understand and then advise those customers. You have an opportunity here, and then to marry that up with the funds that the state has. So I don't see enough coordination when there's an opportunity like that of taking that data and helping to better empower those customers. You guys know what loads look like. You could probably guess, what exactly is going on in everybody's house or business just by the shape of the load profile, whereas the average consumer, and particularly a small one without sophisticated resources, will not. And that would be an easy way to add capacity and resource with what we have today. So let's leverage our information in a smarter way and looking to how to do that through what utilities provide and propose in Act 129. Something we did hear about earlier today was the notion of time of use rates. And, couldn't have said it better the way that it was stated about, right? Smart meters, dumb rates. It is appallingly difficult to participate in time of use rates, regardless of which utility we're talking about. I'm not pointing the finger at any single one. It should really be something that is easier to ramp up on and a bigger part of how we are looking to conserve resources, right? I will make smart choices in how I use power. So will commercial concerns if it is far easier for them to participate in time of use rates. So they're officially on the books, but not really particularly used. In Act 129, it would be great to see more of a metric around participation as a percentage of the customer base in each of the rate classes. It is a small portion of the customer base that is taking advantage of the program, and so rethinking how to really drive a higher rate of participation is something that we think would be important for affecting change. And then kind of one of the really frustrating things that happens here in the Commonwealth is across the street, right? We had a lot of conversation today that was great about the need for more distributed energy resources, and solar is a piece of that. That we need all of the above, to Tori's point, we absolutely do. But let's say we want to accelerate that. We're sitting on $156 million under the Solar for All program that is, pretty well stalled out based on actions in the legislature at the moment. And that could change, and then we could capitalize on it and leverage that money, which is not ratepayer money, and it is not Pennsylvania state tax dollars. So it is kind of crazy that we're not. Left hand, right hand would be wonderful to see more engagement in cooperation and shake. And lastly, when it comes to energy efficiency, I just want to note, and this is really only a very small segment because it's residential only, but last year in 2023, under the federal 25C tax credit, that was extended for 10 years, there were 134,720 customers in Pennsylvania, IRS tax filings that filed that particular tax credit for energy efficiency. So that should signal the desire from customers in the Commonwealth to make those improvements in their residences. And the interesting thing about those numbers, when you look at them at the national level, and I wasn't able to dig down for Pennsylvania, is that nationally, the numbers are much bigger. And there's at least 900,000 across the country that are people who make 100,000 to, I think it's 250. But there's also 100,000 amongst households that fill three brackets of 25,000 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 to 100. So there's almost an equal number of people across the country who are not necessarily with affluent means making investments in energy efficiency and taking a tax credit on it. And I think that speaks volumes. And lastly, just thank you again. As others have said, this is incredibly helpful. We hope that you will repeat it, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. All right, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to all of you and to everyone who testified today, and also to the audience for sticking with us for the day, and the folks who are watching online. I want to remind everyone that you can file comments. Anyone who is interested, not just the folks who participated today, please file your comments. And the deadline to file those comments has been extended to January 9th, 2025. You can e-file with the secretary, or you can file in the secretary's bureau, paper copies if you choose. And just check our website, the docket number is there. And once again, thank you all. This has been incredibly helpful. You gave us a lot to think about. I'm going to turn this over to Commissioner Zerfas and then the chairman to close us out.
Well, given the hour, I will just yield to the chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, make them extra good for me, please.
I'll be wrapped up in about a half hour. Sit down, Steve. Sit down. I'll be quick. I just want to thank all the panelists. I think this was a great discussion today. As I said, this was our first tech conference we've had in years here. This is a big issue. It's impacting ratepayers, all over the Commonwealth here. So it was an important conversation to have. I'd like to thank the Vice Chair for her leadership on this issue. Kayla, great job in putting this conference together. I know there's a lot of hard work. Yes. A lot of hard work put into this. We are going to take all this information back and figure out where we go from here. The problem certainly isn't solved, but we're on our path to addressing it. And finally, as the Vice Chair said, we did extend the comment period, so happy holidays. We didn't want folks filing comments on, I think it was the 27th of December, something like that. So we're into the beginning of January. So again, I appreciate the audience as well, sticking through this all day long. But as I said, these are important topics that we need to figure this out. So with that, thank you. Have a good day.